They didn't respond. That silence, it wasn't just a pause. It was a message, a weapon, and you felt it. It's not the insult that breaks you. It's the space after. The moment they ignore your message, leave your hand hanging, make you wait like a dog at the door. That's when it hits. That's when the leash tightens. You told yourself you were just being patient. You told yourself it was mature to give them space, to not overreact, to take the high road. But here's the truth no one wants to say out loud. You weren't being calm, you were being controlled. And deep down, you knew it. Because the more you held back, the more they played, the more they pushed, the more you rationalized, the more power you gave away, the more you had to pretend you didn't want it. Until one day, you woke up in a life that didn't even feel like yours. That's the slow kill, the invisible theft of your self-respect. You lose power every time you wait for their attention. You lose power every time you explain yourself to someone who's already decided not to listen. You lose power every time you betray your instinct to keep a relationship that doesn't even recognize your value. Not because you're weak, but because they taught you to believe power means dominance. It doesn't. Power means silence, on your terms. Power means control, not over them, but over your own nervous system. Power means restraint, so clean it looks like distance. That's what they fear, and that's what you were never taught. But you will be now, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you feel it, you never chase again. They will test you, not with insults, not with fists, not even with lies. They'll test you with kindness. They'll hand you a compliment after a week of absence and watch how fast you forget the silence. They'll send a meme, a heart emoji, you've been on my mind, and they'll watch if you bite. They don't need to argue with you. They just need to confirm one thing, that you still need their approval to feel complete. And if you do, it's over. They own you again. That's the game. Subtle, beautiful, brutal. You think the enemy is loud disrespect. It's not. It's selective warmth, strategic indifference. Just enough to make you question yourself. That's what Machiavelli warned about, not in the words people quote to sound intelligent, but in the space between the lines. He didn't care about morality. He studied outcomes. And the coldest truth he uncovered wasn't about cruelty. It was about timing, he said. The promise given was a necessity of the past. The word broken is a necessity of the present. Read that again. He wasn't talking about betrayal. He was talking about leverage. They will promise you consistency, but deliver confusion, because a stable version of you is harder to manipulate. A confused version of you? Predictable, hungry, dependent. So they study your cravings. They learn your rhythm. They give just enough, then take it back. And you who never learned to sit with silence mistake it for love. That's the trap. You want to pass the test? Here's how they know they've lost control. You don't flinch when they withhold. You don't chase when they vanish. You don't respond to breadcrumbs. You burn the trail. Not loudly, not with rage, just nothing. Still, calm, clean, gone. The minute you make peace with being misunderstood, you stop leaking power. Because when they can't read you, they can't reach you. And that's when you become dangerous. You used to explain everything. Your intentions, your tone, your silence, your worth. Every time someone pulled away, you filled the gap with justification, hoping somewhere in your clarity they'd finally see you. But they didn't want to understand you. They wanted you explaining. Because as long as you're explaining, you're not deciding. And that's the position they need you in hesitant. Because the more they confuse you, the easier you are to manage. So they do it on purpose. Disagree with things you never said, react to things you never did. Twist your peace into punishment. They pretend your silence is manipulation just to break it. And every time you try to clarify, defend, decode, you give them exactly what they came for, control of your focus. See, Machiavelli didn't just write about political strategy. He revealed the human blueprint for power. Whoever controls the narrative controls the outcome. And if you're always explaining your story to people who distort it, you've already lost it. They don't want your truth. They want the emotional reaction they can use against you. So they provoke it. Smiling, innocent, curious. Why are you being so distant lately? Why didn't you just say that earlier? I didn't know it hurt you like that. And because you crave fairness, you take the bait. You explain. Again and again. Not realizing they never cared about the truth. Only their advantage inside your reaction. So stop. Stop handing out clarity to people who weaponize it. Stop breaking your own heart trying to be understood by someone who benefits from misunderstanding you. Let them be confused. Let them invent their version of you. Let them gossip, twist, project. And while they do, you stay quiet. You get sharp. You build. Because real power isn't about changing their mind. It's about never needing to. They didn't reject you. They revealed you. There's a difference, one they hope you never notice. See, rejection feels personal, emotional, heavy. It makes you question yourself. But revelation? That's clinical, cold, precise. Rejection wounds the ego. Revelation destroys the illusion. When they walked away, they weren't leaving something valuable. They were exposing their inability to recognize it. And if that cuts, good. Let it. Because that's where your softness turns into steel. The truth is, they never saw you. Not really. They saw your utility, your loyalty, your emotional supply. But your essence, your discipline, your edge, too inconvenient, too unreadable, too sovereign. That's why they pulled away. That's why they tested your silence, poked your boundaries, and turned your calm into conflict. Not because they were confused, but because you were starting to feel untouchable. And untouchable is dangerous. You think they feared losing you? Number. They feared the version of you that no longer needed to be kept. Because the moment you stopped chasing, something shifted. Their words got slower. Their charm got awkward. Their control started glitching. They could feel it, the fracture in the game. Not because you screamed, not because you exposed them, but because you didn't. Your detachment was deafening. And nothing terrifies a manipulator more than silence that feels final. This is Machiavellian power. Note revenge. Note exposure. But strategic invisibility. You don't burn bridges. You remove the roads they travel. You don't block them. You disappear so fully they start questioning if they ever really knew you. And when they reach for you months later, years later, they find nothing. Not anger. Not closure. Just air. Because the final act of power isn't winning them back. It's realizing you never needed to. Here's what they don't tell you about power. It's not loud. It's not savage. It's not viral. It's the decision you make alone and never speak of again. It's the conversation you don't reply to, the call you let ring out, the moment you feel the need to explain yourself and don't. That's when your nervous system starts recalibrating. Not toward peace. Peace is passive. Toward presence. The kind of presence they can feel without you having to say a word. The kind that enters a room before you do and lingers long after you leave. This is what they tried to keep you from. Not confidence, not strength. Stillness. Because a still person is unreadable. A still person is unpredictable. A still person doesn't react. They decide. And most people don't want to deal with someone who decides. They want the version of you that hesitates, that doubts, that needs one more text, one more answer, one more apology. Because that version of you is moldable. But you're done being molded. Because you saw the pattern. You watched yourself become everything they needed and nothing you respected. You softened your voice, shrank your standards, blurred your instincts. And in return, they gave you uncertainty. That wasn't love, that was leverage. And the moment you stopped asking why, the moment you stopped needing closure, the moment you accepted they will never say the thing that makes it make sense, you got your power back. Not in a single moment, but in micro decisions. You didn't check their page. You didn't draft the message. You didn't wait for the next chance to be chosen. You let them keep the narrative. You took the pen. That's the difference between healing and evolution. Healing still hopes they'll understand you someday. Evolution doesn't need them to. You think they let you go? Number, they watched you walk and prayed you'd turn around. They called it space, time, distance. But what they really meant was delay. They needed you to doubt yourself just long enough for them to reset the frame, because they know how this works. They always have. You don't stay because of love. You stay because of uncertainty. The what if, the maybe, the story that hasn't ended. And they keep it open just enough for you to hang yourself with hope. That's the real cruelty. They never needed to hurt you. They just needed you to keep wondering. And you did. You wondered what changed. You wondered what you did wrong. You wondered if you were too much, too cold, too distant. But the question you never asked was the one that mattered most. Why were you trying to keep someone who wasn't trying to keep you? Not once, not consistently, not completely. That's when it clicks, not in your mind, but in your body. The weight of all the times you waited for a message that never came. The nights you rehearsed your boundaries just to get talked out of them. The conversations you had with yourself, pretending they could hear you. Gone. And what's left? Clarity. The kind that doesn't come with a quote or a journal or a podcast. The kind that feels like a closing door, final, quiet, clean. That's the point of no return. Not when you stop loving them. When you stop explaining them to your friends, to your therapist, to yourself. When you stop saying things like, they just need time. They're going through a lot. They didn't mean it like that. Because the moment you stop making sense of their chaos, you stop inviting it into your life. They called you cold, but let's be honest, they weren't afraid of your coldness. They were afraid of your clarity. When you stopped reacting, they didn't feel abandoned. They felt exposed, because your silence wasn't distance. It was a mirror, and in it, they saw the version of themselves they'd been avoiding, the manipulator, the coward, the emotional beggar behind the charm. So they did what weak people do when they can't control someone. They rebranded you. Detached became heartless. Boundaries became selfish. Your composure must be narcissism. Anything but accountability. And you watched it happen, quietly. Not because you didn't have the words, but because you didn't need to defend a truth that proved itself. That's when you realized your power isn't in being liked. It's in being unshakable. You don't argue anymore. You observe. You don't perform anymore. You preserve. You don't chase anymore. You choose. That's what terrifies them. Because when you were nice, you were predictable. You absorbed their guilt, their confusion, their tantrums, and they mistook it for loyalty. But now, you're not emotional, you're effective. You're not angry, you're unavailable. You're not broken, you're just done. Done explaining, done validating, done playing human bandage to someone who never wanted to stop bleeding. This isn't a phase. This isn't a trend. This is your final form. Calm, clear, closed. Not because you hate them, but because you finally realized you were never hard to love. They were just too weak to love you without conditions. They thought your silence was weakness. But you weren't silent because you had nothing to say. You were silent because nothing needed to be said. You already saw the pattern, the way they drew you close with softness, then punished you for trusting it. The way they played victim when you finally pulled away, as if your boundaries were betrayal. The way they twisted every confrontation into confusion, not to find truth, but to buy time. You weren't quiet because you were hurt. You were quiet because you were done feeding the fire they kept pretending wasn't burning you. This is what they don't understand. You didn't want revenge. You wanted peace, but they couldn't allow that, because your peace makes them irrelevant. And when you make peace without permission, manipulators lose the only currency they have, your reaction. So they provoke you, indirectly, casually, A like on your story, a comment in your circle, a cryptic post that sounds just familiar enough to pull your attention, not because they miss you, but because they miss the power they had when you needed closure. But you don't need it anymore, because closure isn't something they give. Closure is the moment you realize the story you were telling yourself about who they were, about what it meant, about how it could have been was just that, a story, a narrative written from your wounds, not your worth. And now that narrative is over. No dramatic ending, no final message, no monologue, just silence. Not the fragile kind that hopes to be broken. The final kind, the sovereign kind. You're not waiting anymore. You're not watching anymore. You're building. Quietly, deliberately, unapologetically. Because the most Machiavellian move you'll ever make is living like they never had the power to stop you. You were never addicted to them. You were addicted to the feeling of being chosen by someone who could barely choose themselves. You mistook the chase for chemistry. You confused unpredictability with passion. You called it deep because it hurt. But it wasn't deep. It was disorganized, dysregulated, designed to keep you in survival mode, calling chaos connection and silence intimacy. That wasn't love. That was a nervous system screaming for stability and getting silence in return. And still, you stayed. Not because you didn't see it, but because you were taught that leaving made you heartless, that walking away meant you failed, that the strong thing was to keep proving your love until it broke them open. But it didn't break them open. It broke you, bit by bit, boundary by boundary, until you couldn't even recognize the version of you that once said, "I'd never tolerate that." But here's the paradox. That version of you, the one who swore they'd never settle, is the one you've been circling back to this entire time. Because that version wasn't naive. They were untamed. Before the apology addiction, before the self-blame spiral, before you learned to interpret disrespect as a challenge to overcome, you were clear. You were dangerous. You were whole. And now, you're not becoming someone new. You're becoming someone remembered. Someone who doesn't seek peace through people who cause war. Someone who doesn't fear being misunderstood by the very minds that distorted them. Someone who doesn't explain anymore. Because when you reach this level of presence, the story ends. Not with closure, with command. And those who once played chess with your self-worth, they no longer know the rules. You don't even hate them. That's what makes it lethal. You're not bitter. You're not emotional. You're not waiting for karma or closure or some final scene where they finally understand what they lost. Because by the time they do, it won't matter. You won't be there. And that's the part they never expected. They expected rage. They expected obsession. They expected you to orbit their absence like a satellite, always close enough to keep feeding the story. But you didn't orbit. You vanished. Not out of spite, but because you evolved. You stopped needing to win. You stopped needing to be right. You stopped needing their name to mean anything when spoken in your mind. They became what they were always destined to be. A symbol, a signal, a severance. The version of you that needed them doesn't exist anymore. The version that over-explained, overgave, overstayed that version has been buried. Not mourned, not memorialized, buried. And what rose from that grave? Not a better version. A colder one. Not heartless, just immune. Not ruthless, just informed. Not disconnected, just done. Done arguing with ghosts. Done negotiating with patterns. Done betraying your instinct to serve your attachment. They won't believe you've changed. Because they never understood you to begin with. They only knew the shape you took to make them comfortable. And now that shape is gone. There's nothing to twist. Nothing to chase. Nothing left to mirror. Just silence. And somewhere, behind a screen, they're too proud to admit they still use to check on you. They feel it. And it haunts them. Here's the final truth. They never took your power. You handed it to them slowly, quietly, piece by piece, every time you needed their recognition to feel real. And they knew Not because they were smarter, but because they were hungrier. Hungry for control. Hungry for emotional supply. Hungry for someone just self-aware enough to blame themselves, but not detached enough to walk away. You were perfect. Until you weren't. Until your silence stopped being soft. Until your absence stopped being temporary. Until your restraint stopped being about keeping the peace and started becoming your identity. You didn't just stop talking. You stopped leaking. Leaking energy. Leaking presence. Leaking the kind of love they thought they could always return to. That faucet is closed. And now? Now they realize what you were. Not a lover. Not a savior. Not a solution. A standard. One they'll never reach again. Because now, you're different. Not louder. Not meaner. Just unreachable. You walk lighter. You move sharper. You don't forgive faster. You forget more completely. Not out of cruelty, but necessity. Because when someone teaches you to devalue your presence, you don't argue with them. You make it rare. And when they come back, let them find dust. Let them find silence. Let them find the version of you they never thought could exist without them. The one that no longer needs to be seen, because that's the final move. Not to make them regret losing you, but to become someone they never had the power to touch again.